Hey friend, and welcome to this presentation. Did you know that Ellen White was not a plagiarist? There's all these different ideas out there. People argue, oh, she copied writings of other people. Was that right for her day? Did she do what was right, or did she do what was wrong? Let me present you a new and fresh perspective for you to handle, for you to digest. So let's take a look. We're answering the question, did Ellen White plagiarize other people's books? Well, around 1980, an Adventist minister by the name of Walter Ray began to make serious charges against Ellen G. White to the effect that she got her messages out of other books by other authors rather than from the Lord, and that her writings were merely plagiarisms from the writings of others passed off as her own. Now, Ray wrote a book expounding his charges with considerable bombast. Church publications such as the Adventist Review and the Ministry carried articles relating to these matters through a good part of the 1980s. In addition, the Ellen G. White estate prepared documents about these things. Now, did Ellen White ever use the wording of someone else in her writings without giving credit? Yes or no? Well, I believe yes, she did. Walter Ray once claimed that 90% of her works was copied. This is both an overstatement and a misrepresentation of Ellen G. White. No objective measure of this phenomenon comes anywhere near that amount from which he quoted. Now, the General Conference asked Dr. Fred Veltman, then chairman of the religion department at the Pacific Union College, to undertake a study of the book The Desire of Ages to ascertain how much literary relationship it might hold to previously published books. Now, it was a huge job, but he undertook it. Dr. Veltman chose 15 chapters randomly in order to keep the study manageable. Even so, it took him and a few helpers several years to do the job. Dr. Veltman drew up seven classifications of possible relationship, from the very remote to a word-for-word parallel. He came up with a figure of around 30% of the material he studied that resembled to a greater or lesser degree the works of others that Ellen G. White might have consulted. Now, where the correspondence is fairly close, I don't think there is any doubt that Miss White utilized the other work. Where it is not so close, borrowing would be more difficult to prove. On those, I'm more willing to reserve judgment. Now, what does this all mean? Was Miss White a fraud, attempting to deceive people by passing off the works of others as her own? Well, no, I don't think so. In the Review and Herald and Signs of the Times, these publications, she recommended the Life and Epistles of St. Paul by Conybeare and Howson, a book she was drawing on for her own book, Sketches from the Life of Paul, which would be published the following year. This is not the behavior of someone who's attempting to hide something or trying to do some dishonest practice. She was open about it. Further, she openly proclaimed in the introduction to The Great Controversy, one of the flagship books of the Adventist Church, that she had used the writings of others, sometimes without giving credit. And she also says why. She has a statement from The Great Controversy saying, "The great events which have marked the progress of reform in past ages are matters of history, well known and universally acknowledged by the Protestant world. They are facts which none can gainsay. The history I have presented briefly in accordance with the scope of the book, and the brevity which must necessarily be observed, the facts having been condensed into a little space as seemed consistent with a proper understanding of their application. In some cases where a historian has so grouped together events as to afford in brief a comprehensive view of the subject, or has summarized details in a convenient manner, his words have been quoted, but in some instances no specific credit has been given, since the quotations are not given for the purpose of citing that writer as authority, but because his statement affords a ready and forcible presentation of the subject in narrating the experience and views of those carrying forward the work of reform in our own time. Similar use has been made of their published works." Now, Miss White's concern was to get the meaning across. If others had expressed well the meaning that she wanted to convey, she felt free to use their words without credit if she was not citing the other author as an authority. Was this legitimate in her time? Well, several Adventist scholars who have done substantial careful reading and study of the 19th century Bible commentators came to the conclusion that this was common practice in her day. In Ellen White's day, this was common. The commentators borrowed heavily from one another and almost never gave credit. Before Miss White's time, John Wesley followed the same practice. When he began to write and preach, he determined that he would note the source of every idea he drew from someone else. But then he said, after continuing on this experiment of referencing, he finally decided to note none of them, because it distracted from the point that he wanted to make, and he couldn't always be sure he had properly given the source for each item. Miss White grew up in the Methodist tradition, and so her view likely came from Wesley's, and it was something that she adopted earlier on. Miss White's practice was not inconsistent. It was not inconsistent with the standards of her day. And she acknowledged her practices and the reasons for it in the introduction to the Great Controversy, which I've shared. So, was it plagiarism? The General Conference Legal Department hired a lawyer who specialized in copyright issues to review Miss White's writings and the charges that were brought against her. After the lawyer spent 300 hours at this task, he said there is no case. Remick said that he would be delighted to defend Miss White in a court of law on these issues. So this is a wonderful truth, and this is something that I want you to consider. If you have been having doubts on Ellen G. White, if you've been thinking that she was a plagiarist, well, I want to assure you that what she did in her time was absolutely okay and right. Nowadays, living in this modern time, we have a temptation to look back and judge based on our current situation. The rules of today were not the same as the rules of far back yesterday. And so I hope and pray that you today will change. If you perhaps had a wrong idea of Miss White's writings, thinking that she was some copyist, plagiarist, buffoon, well, no, she wasn't that. And I can assure you we can trust her writings as the revealed will of God to us today. May God bless you and keep you until we study again.